as soon as Ukraine comes into being, the Bolsheviks try and invade and try and snuff out that, because they recognize that without Ukraine, can Russia be a great power? And obviously, they're very different to the Tsars and the imperial state, but they still have that sort of innate sense of that kind of superiority, really, and that Russia has to have this sort of region where it controls. And so, in some ways, it's a reaction to that. It's an idea that these states that were, that were emerged after the First World War, really still belong to Russia, and they haven't really, they're only really free because it's all sort of a plot by the West or a plot by Germany or whatever. But actually, these are real states. These have, their own national identities and national stories. And I think that's part of the Russian desire to wipe the slate clean and recover the Tsarist position that it held in 1914.
Hello and welcome to a special edition of Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today delighted to be joined by the historian Nick Lloyd to talk about his new book, which is called The Eastern Front, A History of the First World War, and it's out now. Nick, thank you so much for joining us.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
In his review of the book for The Times, Dominic Sambrook said your book is the First World War from a refreshingly unfamiliar angle. What did you set out to achieve with it?
Well, yeah, I mean, the premise is that this is going to be 3 books on the entire history of the war. And so I started writing a history of the Western Front, which is the front that I think most people know about or familiar with when they think about the First World War, the trenches in France, the Somme, Ypres, that kind of thing. And when I started writing that, I thought, I can't leave it at this. I've got to do the Eastern Front, the war in Poland and Galicia, the war with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, with the Russian Empire. And so really that was the purpose of it, was really to look again at that part of the war which has often gone understudied. Churchill called it the unknown war. And it's a part of the war that certainly in Britain we're not that familiar with. And so it was really interesting for me to look at it and actually begin to put some of the pieces back into the puzzle, I suppose.
And how does it compare? I mean, you're right, we know a lot more, particularly in the UK, about the fighting on the Western Front. How does the Eastern Front compare in terms of its bloodiness and some of the fighting we saw in that arena?
Well, yes, I mean, it is a very bloody part of the war. I mean, the Russians, at least 2 million casualties. The Austrians, about 1.2 million casualties. You have enormous amounts of violence against civilians as well on the Eastern Front, which is, largely absent from the war in the West. You do get ethnic cleansing in aspects and parts of the war in the East. And so it is extremely bloody. And I think we sometimes think that the Western Front was the worst or the most bloodiest part of the war, and that's not necessarily true. Some of the battles in the East were horrendous in terms of the number of casualties. Now, I'll give you an example. Just in the winter of 1914 and the spring of 1915, the Austro-Hungarians suffer about 800,000 casualties. That's in just that small period of the war. And so you're talking about rivers of blood, which, again, have largely gone sort of unmentioned, or we kind of skim over these things. But the fighting in the East was absolutely horrendous.
And in terms of the nature of the fighting, everyone remembers the sort of trench warfare of the Western Front. How did it compare in the East?
Yeah, I mean, the East is different in the sense that it's much bigger than the West. It's about 1,600 kilometers, over 900 miles in length, usually. I mean, it changes as you go through the war, but it's a much broader, wider vista of operations. And so you don't get quite the level of claustrophobia and deadlock that you have in the West. There are always scope for breakthroughs, always scope for maneuvers and mobile operations in the East. And so that's really the main difference that we have with the West. The simply is it's more difficult to get the kind of deadlock. You have periods of trench warfare, and there are trenches in the East, but it's never that confined and congested. And so for many commanders, operating on the East gives them more room for maneuver, both sort of literal and in a sort of broader sense, really.
A lot of the book focuses, understandably, on the Austro-Hungarian army. And you describe it really as being a bit of a basket case. Just tell us a bit more about how it was led and its failures.
Well, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, is really at the heart of the war in the East. It's the reason, it wants to strike down Serbia, and that, of course, brings the Russians in. But the problem with the Habsburg Empire is it's really wanting to fight a war that it is not equipped to fight, and it's had in the years before the war, it hasn't really invested that much in its military. There's huge budgetary struggles between the different halves of the empire, the Hungarian half and the Austrian half. It has huge amounts of ethnic difference and languages across the army, which essentially makes it quite fragile, particularly when you lose a lot of officers, which you do inevitably quite early on. You have three languages in the army. You have, the regimental language, you have a language of command, and you have essentially a broader language that most of the officers know German, and that German is supposed to offer a kind of coherency to operations within the army. But once those officers have gone or moved on, often you get regiments that can't really speak to their officers, and so it becomes quite fragile. And so the Austrians are also very, very light in firepower. So their artillery is notoriously light. They don't have enough guns. They don't have enough medium or heavy artillery, which really is crucial in trench warfare or operations when you're trying to break down defenses. And so when they tangle with the Russians, I mean, the Russians have plenty of problems, but they're rapidly sort of out muscled and out fought, and the amount of firepower they need, they simply can't generate. And so what you tend to see on the Eastern Front is German troops and German resources have to be essentially parceled out and given and transfused into the Habsburg Empire to keep it from collapsing, because they have the Austrians have very, very wide strategic goals, but the army is just not capable of achieving it, and they get into trouble very, very early on.
It's really interesting, isn't it, how, for pretty much all the great powers, maybe what they expected going into the war in 1914 and what ended up happening were two very different things. I mean, obviously in the UK, there were people signing up thinking it would all be over by Christmas. It was the Great War. It was somehow quite an exciting war. And then we saw that 4 years of bloody grinding conflict on the Western Front. And for the Austrians as well, maybe there was, I don't know, was it complacency? Was it just a complete underestimation of the brutality of war? Why was there that gap between what they thought would happen, a war to defend their empire, and what ended up happening?
I think that's a really good question, and it's very difficult to answer in some respects. I think nobody realizes how bad the war is going to be. I don't think anyone, even the most pessimistic commentator in 1914, realized how long it's going to go on for and how high the blood cost is going to be. I think the Austrians, they want to be able to strike down Serbia, as I said, but of course that brings with it Russian intervention, and so there's almost a gleeful unwillingness to really consider Russian intervention. They sort of assume it won't happen. They assume that the Russians will back down. And then once it's becoming evident that the Russians are not going to back down, in fact, they're actually mobilizing their army, 4.5 million men, the biggest army in the world at the time. This produces a kind of cataclysm in Vienna where they realize that actually they might want to strike Serbia, but they're going to have to move most of their army to fight the Russians. And also, you have this very bizarre situation where the Germans are saying to the Austrians, look, don't worry about Serbia. We can deal with Serbia when we've won. Now, if we're going to fight this war, we can't attack Russia straight away because they're slower to mobilize. And so we are going to fight in the West. 7/8 of our army is going to France. And so you have to fight, put all your army against the Russians to hold them off. And so the Austrians want to fight Serbia. The Germans want to fight France, and nobody really wants to fight Russia, and so they have to. And so you get this real split strategies within the Central Powers about who they should be fighting and when they should be fighting, and it produces this kind of carnage in those opening days. And as for the Russians, they're also confused. They want to fight the Austrians, who they think correctly are going to be weaker, the weakest of the opponents they faced, and they're quite like to take some nice chunks of Austrian territory, but they might never have a better chance in the opening weeks of the war to attack Germany when you only got one army in East Prussia. But they don't really want to do that, and so you can really see almost a comedy of errors in that Eastern Front where no one really fights the war they actually want to fight.
Is it fair to say it's a book in which almost no one comes out well?
Yeah, it is very different from the Western Front in that sense, and it is very interesting that it's a war in some ways. The Eastern Front is a war that nobody wins, everybody loses. So by 1918, it looks like the Germans have won in the East. Russia is in revolution. The Bolsheviks have taken army over, and its army has collapsed. But obviously, by 1918, Germany collapses. The Habsburg Empire limps on to 1918, but then collapses. Even Serbia, who is on the winning side, suffers such heavy losses. I think it's the worst, per head of population casualty rate of any power in the war. So Serbia is devastated. And so, and you obviously have places like Romania, which are invaded. Italy wins, but suffers horrendous casualties and has a feeling that it hasn't really won anything. It's really been abused. And so that sort of fosters that feeling of betrayal and anger. And so the Eastern Front is really unique in that sense that what you have is a kind of black hole, a vacuum opens in 1917 and 1918 in the East with the Russian Revolution and the Civil War and the collapse of those great empires. And, it is, it causes such untold suffering as those kind of new states have to rise up through an era of civil war and unrest and civil violence, which goes on through the 1920s, isn't really solved by the Second World War and into the Cold War. So the Eastern Front really is absolutely cataclysmic in that sense.
It's a really good point you make, and I want to come back to the legacy of the fighting on the Eastern Front and how, in many ways, as you rightly point out, the conflict didn't necessarily end in 1918. But just in writing this book, Nick, you say that you wanted to cover a part of the war that gets less coverage than the fighting on the Western Front. Did you change your analysis of the conflict through the process of researching and writing the book?
Yeah, I mean, I've prior to this, I'd mainly written about the Western Front, so that really had been my war. And so by going into this, like virgin territory in many ways, so it was really refreshing for me to look at it. And I think I appreciated the war in a number of different ways. First of all, I think I see the East very much as a laboratory of war, where the different sides are trying out tactics and technologies that they will use in the West. Germany does this a number of times. They trial the first use of poison gases on the East, the first use of sort of infiltration tactics and stormtroop tactics that we see, different artillery tactics, different kinds of artillery bombardments and barrages. And so you do see this with the East. I think it's also given me a really good understanding that the timelines of the war are different in the East than they are in the West. Now, certainly from a British perspective, we're used to seeing the war, from a start in 1914, and then gradually the British component gets more and more until we get to the summer of 1916, where the British army is in France in strength. And really for Britain's war, it kind of begins in 1916 in that way. And heavy fighting in 1917. And that's the trench warfare, the deadlock period that's kind of intrinsic to how we see the war. But if you look at it from the Eastern Front's perspective, by really the summer of 1916, there isn't really that much fighting. The fighting's kind of over. And so by the time the British are beginning to start to fight on the Somme with a big volunteer army, Kitchener's new army, the Russian army is basically done. It's over. So, from the summer and autumn of 1916, the Russian army then begins to start that slow process of collapse, which then it will really collapse the following year. And so I think it really gives us a new understanding of the importance of those early years, 1914 and 1915 in the East, which are in some ways more decisive than they are in the West. And so there's little things like that. I think if you look at the Eastern time frame, it's quite different than it is on the West. And I think that was kind of a revelation to me. And I think if you see it in that sense, it really gives more of an understanding to what's going on in the West and why the fighting takes place in the way that it does, as opposed to the East. So yeah, I found that personally quite fascinating.
Let's just return to a really interesting point, Nick, you made a moment ago about how for the countries on the Eastern Front, the war, in a sense, didn't end in 1918, and its legacy was felt through the 1920s, even into the Cold War era. Do you think there was any sense of that at the time, that these sort of the fracturing of empires would have a lasting legacy, or do you think people were completely naive to it?
I think the peoples of the Eastern Front weren't naive. I think they recognised that once these empires had collapsed, it was really about the local strongmen coming in and trying to control it. And you obviously had the influence of communism and Bolshevism, which is spreading into Poland and Hungary and Austria and places like that. And so there is that real sense that the war changes. It's a new kind of war. It's an ideological war. It's more about the people. The people are really at the front line. So the armies are much less conventional than they were in 1914. And so that really becomes an issue. And if you look at it, I think in terms of the Western Front, we have that great moment where it all goes silent on the 11th of November. And that's the war, black and white. It ends on that day or that hour, that minute. And that's become legendary. It never happens in the East. There's always violence in the East. There's always something going on because even though the Russians go out of the war in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March of 1918, they are still fighting. They're still fighting internally. They're still fighting civil war. The Bolsheviks then invade Poland after the war. And so it really just rolls on. And obviously a lot of the time that the victors spend at the Treaty of Versailles or the peace negotiations at Versailles are really all about boundaries and borders and trying to work out what will succeed these empires in the East, where the borders are going to lie, which states are going to control access to certain rivers or certain cities or certain areas of resource. And so it's an unsolvable problem in many ways.
I was also struck by, your description of Russia being this enemy to the East that no one necessarily really wanted to have to confront, but you can't ignore it. And that brings us, I suppose, to the situation today and what has happened for the last 100 years, whereby Russia has always occupied that status. And that for, the Central European and Western European powers, Russia is a factor they may not want to confront, but at some stage they need to.
Yeah, I mean, it's embedded deep within obviously the Baltic states and Poland, the threat from the east, and that obviously goes back to the First War and before. But I think in some ways the sort of Russian imperial moment that we're going through is a kind of a long-awaited reaction to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, when the western half of Russia, the Russian Empire, is torn away or is brought away by the Central Powers, and you have the creation of these nominally independent states. Obviously, they're under Central Powers control, but nominally independent states that carve out their own destinies, and you have the resurgence and the recovery, a rebirth of Poland. And obviously Ukraine, Ukraine comes about in 1918. They are delegates at the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and despite initially supporting them, the Bolsheviks, as soon as Ukraine comes into being, the Bolsheviks try and invade and try and snuff out that because they recognize that without Ukraine, can Russia be a great power? And obviously they're very different to the Tsars and the imperial state, but they still have that sort of innate sense of that kind of superiority, really, and that Russia has to have this sort of region where it controls. And so, in some ways, it's a reaction to that. It's an idea that these states that were emerged after the First World War really still belong to Russia, and they haven't really, they're only really free because it's all sort of a plot by the West or a plot by Germany or whatever. But actually, these are real states. These have their own national identities and national stories. And I think that's part of the Russian desire to wipe the slate clean and recover the Tsarist position that it held in 1914.
How do you think the First World War is viewed by ordinary Russians today? I mean, the Second World War looms, I would imagine, far larger in the psyche, seen as a great victory over European aggressors. But where does the First World War sit in the Russian psyche now, Nick?
Well, it's difficult because it's all related to the revolution, of course. Obviously in the Soviet period, the revolution was the founding moment of the USSR, and a moment that was much mythologized in propaganda, in literature and film. The idea that the class system collapsed, it was overthrown by the people, and obviously this was slightly, there are two revolutions in 1917. There's the abdication of the Tsar. There's the formation of the provisional government, and then you have the Bolshevik coup d'etat in November. So the revolution, really is the story of Russia's story in the war. Once the USSR and Soviet Union collapses, the revolution becomes, somewhat more problematic because obviously the last thing the last thing Putin really wants people to think about is how to overthrow a corrupt autocratic regime. So the revolution is, Putin is a creature of the USSR, so he has a certain fondness for this kind of thing, but it's inherently political, and so there is a certain wariness towards it. At the same time, you do have a kind of growing cult of personality around the Tsar, the execution of the Tsar and his family, and that idea that he sort of symbolizes a kind of good Russia, an Orthodox Russia. And so his cult of personality and almost worship in some cases has grown quite considerably, really, since the end of the Soviet Union. And so he has still kind of had his moment where he's being revised, and instead of being seen as a somewhat ineffectual figure, but seen as a much more warmer sense. And so the memory of that war and that period is continually kind of evolving and shifting, but it is still a period, I think, of intense sort of unease, I think would be the right word, both in the Russian people, but also in the Russian elite as well.
How would you assess Vladimir Putin's worldview when it comes to the history of Russia and Europe over the past century or so? I mean, I don't know if you caught any of that remarkable interview he did with Tucker Carlson, where he essentially walks him through his theory of Russian history, and it was, pretty historically inaccurate in many places, but revealing as to his worldview. What did you make of that, Nick?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was very interesting, and I think it's important. History is often sort of dismissed as not being relevant or anything sometimes, but you look at someone like Putin, and history is very, very much there in his psyche and his identity, and his understanding of the world is historically based, though it may be not necessarily factually accurate, but it is deeply emotional and connected to him as a person and his worldview. The idea that, again, as I think I said before, those states that emerged after the First War aren't real states. They're not real people. They're actually just Russians who've been kind of seduced by the West or whatever. And so really their natural home is under Moscow's domination. And so that, he shares that view with generations of Russian autocrats in that sense. And so Putin will be much more recognizable to standard sort of Russian nationalists of the 19th century and so on and so forth. And so there isn't that much surprise or that much difference. I think perhaps for us in the West that aren't exposed to that, I think you can see how powerful historical understandings can be to someone who was determined to right the wrongs of history as he sees it, to get things back on the right track. And of course, not understanding that what happened in the First World War was that old empire collapsed. And when you have old empires collapsing, they're always violent, it's always difficult, huge upheaval that can take decades to work through. And obviously, you have the period in the Second World War where the Soviet Union really expands into Eastern Europe. That was a sort of right period where Russia had restored what it was naturally going to do, and so that really hasn't changed in the mindset of Putin. But I think it's very interesting how important historical reasoning is to him and his worldview, and we shouldn't underestimate that.
You do hear increasingly, Nick, people talking about whether we're on the brink of a third global conflict or even a kind of third world war, if you want to put it that way. Where do you stand on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can understand fears and concerns of angering the Russian bear. And obviously, you have a very, in some ways, very violent and very dangerous individual and a very violent and dangerous state. But I think there are still some things worth fighting for. And I think that sort of Ukrainian statehood is definitely worth fighting for. And so I think in some ways we have to get our heads down and make sure we do what's necessary. And in some ways, the best way to deter Russia is not through weakness, but through strength, through uncompromising strength and making sure that Ukraine can continue the fight. I think weakness only kind of breeds further ambition from Moscow in that sense. It only really reacts to force, it respects force. And I think we have to understand that. That might be quite difficult for us in the West to appreciate. But once you go there and understand this, I think you mean that you have no choice. You're going to have to take a stand on Russia. The question is, do you want to do it from a position of relative strength or a position of weakness? That's really the question you have to answer. Because by letting Russia get its way, you might not prevent World War III. You might actually bring it about.
Or almost appeasement Mark II.
Yeah, I mean there are similarities in that sense. The belief that you can just sort of give you just give a little bit, or you can. Putin is not going to be satisfied with the Donbass or certain oblasts of Ukraine. He wants the whole thing. And we must understand that. And he might temporarily settle for some of those minor territorial adjustments. But ultimately, the ideology is clear. The understanding of history is clear. He's not trying to hide it. Ukraine is a failed state. It's a fake state. It's not a real state. It needs to come back to Russia. That's the ideology. And there's, of course, a complete negation of Ukrainian history, which goes back well beyond, before the First World War and everything. So I think those are some of the points I think we need to bear in mind. We need to understand these people on their own terms and not interpret it, well, he might say that, but actually he means the other thing. Actually, dictators often say exactly what they want and what they mean.
And even were he to completely conquer Ukraine, God forbid, I mean, you can compare him to a shark. A shark needs to keep moving forward, and he wouldn't stop there.
Well, they may stop for a few years or whatever, but it won't fundamentally. It would certainly make the security situation in Europe, very, very perilous. And so I think in some ways it's better to try and stop him where we can, before you allow him to get stronger.
Just finally, Nick, from writing the book, are there other lessons aside from how to approach dictators, for example? But are there other lessons that can be applied from the First World War to today's world?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen certainly in Ukraine. I mean, we've talked about this. We've seen the resurgence of trench warfare, the re-emergence of trench warfare. And if you look at some of the photos and the video images from some of those areas of the heavy fighting, it would, you put it in a black and white filter, and it's straight out of the Western Front. Something like Passchendaele, we have the splintered trees and things. So it's really interesting from my perspective to see the things like people talking about shell shortages. Which we haven't really talked about for decades. And we think from a military perspective, we talked about maneuver and high tempo operations and precision. Actually, what we're seeing now is a more real war, which is about mass attrition, mass death, the amount of artillery shells you can fire. It's about indecisive slogs forward. And so the First World War has a lot of parallels and a lot of things we can draw from that. And ultimately, you need to be able to bring in mass. So we need to rearm. We need to be able to provide, a capability that is, that you can reinforce and you can bring in more shells, bring in more troops, bring in more guns, more tanks. That's something that in the West we really don't want to hear, but it is the ultimate lesson. If you're fighting attritional warfare, you're going to need to do that. And so Ukraine has been a really powerful reminder, whether governments want to hear it or not, but a powerful reminder that war takes mass people, mass equipment, and potentially mass death. That is war, and that's much more of a sort of a standard in international relations than the period we've had of precision, very, very precise, exquisite warfare. Ukraine has shown, I think, the real face of war that, again, is remarkably consistent with what we find in the First World War. I mean, Ukraine is the First World War with drones.
And on that note, we'll leave it there. Nick, it's been a fascinating conversation. It's a brilliant book. It's called The Eastern Front, A History of the First World War by Nick Lloyd, and it's out now. Nick, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to The Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.